Okay, so we're going to be going through a very quick briefing on all of the tools in your base toolbar. So starting with the top, you have the selection tool. This is going to select a basic shape that you have in its entirety. It ignores the anchor points. It is operating as just a basic selection tool. The direct selection tool here is going to specifically select any anchor points that you click on. If you use the marquee, so if you click and drag a rectangle, it will select any within that space. This tool right here, the group selection tool, will also do the same thing. And your lasso tool will select any anchor points within the shape that you draw. So it'll just select those two, leave those two unselected. The pen tool, we're all a little familiar with this one. It'll draw angled lines based on where you're clicking. If you click and drag, it will create a curve, and all of these anchor points will lead to a shape when you connect them together. At any point, you can go into your Properties panel and use your Direct selection tool to click on specific anchor points and manipulate them from there. This right here will turn it from an angle to a curve. And there are a lot more other things you can do within here to manipulate anchor points. The freeform tool creates organic lines instead of those angled ones, and it's actually the opposite. So if you want to have a angled line, you will be double clicking. And the same with that, when you click the point you started at, it will close the shape, and you will have a closed shape that you can then either fill or have as a stroke. There are a lot of things you can do to shapes once they're closed, so be careful with your anchor points, because if you leave them open, you cannot do as much with them. Next is your shape tool. You have a few base shapes. There are more in your secondary tools, specifically the rectangle, the ellipse tool, the polygon tool, which can be set if you click. It will ask you how many sides you want and what the radius is. So let's say I want a bunch of sides in a very small radius. You will more or less end up with a weird circle. So play around with that. The paintbrush, blob tool, pencil, and the smooth tool, which I always add to my toolbar, are used for creating lines. So the paintbrush is more organic lines, and you can create preset textures to the paintbrush. There are some basic ones the Illustrator provides. You could also make your own, which we will cover later. It is useful, and it is detrimental. I'm sure some of you have played around with trying to use Illustrator like Photoshop and painting in it, and Illustrator does not like when there are hundreds and hundreds of strokes on a page. So if you try to use it like a paintbrush and you're creating many individual lines, it will slow down your program. So you want to avoid using it like that. In here as well, the pencil tool is kind of like a free-form pen tool, except it's typically used more with a stylus. So if you're working with a stylus, this can be very useful. If you're working with a mouse, I recommend that you do not use the pencil to create your lines, just because there will be a lot of unnecessary anchor points that you have to then go in and clean up. Next up is your type. There are a lot of type settings and type windows. We're going to be ignoring that for now. Your rotate tool, any shapes that you make, you can set a point for it to rotate at with the rotate tool. And when you do that, you can then drag it from there. So that helps if you're trying to, let's say, make that clover project. You could be rotating it from the point that you set. And I just set it way over there, so that's the rotate tool. Next is the scissors. So if you make a shape, you can use the scissors to actually take that closed space and open it back up. So what I did just there was not just create an anchor point, but create two right next to each other that is now opening up the shape. So it's no longer closed here, which means if I turn this back into just a stroke, it's not going to be closed, it's not going to be a full shape. If you want to connect these two back together, you can simply select them both and do Command J, and they will join back together into a full shape. With the scissor tool is also the eraser tool. The eraser tool will take out chunks of shapes and create anchor points wherever you erase, and then you can select with your direct selection tool the space in between, delete it, and you can cut out shapes that way. There is probably a million different ways you can cut out shapes in Illustrator, but that's one of the best ways if you're using a stylus. Next up is the shape builder tool, which is very fun. So anytime you have shapes that overlap with each other, let's just make a few real quick. So these shapes are all overlapping. If I select all of them and go to the shape builder tool, I can click between two and they will connect. I can click between any random ones and they will then join in to be the same shape. And then I can go through and individually fill some of them in. And you can create some pretty cool abstract things. It speeds up your project quite a bit if you are working with primarily shapes, because I will show you later, this Pathfinder tool does the same thing for singular combinations of two shapes, but if you're doing a lot at once, it's a lot faster to use that tool. Next up is your gradient tool. That will apply a gradient within a shape. You can have a linear or a radius. I'm not going to get into that too much just because we're not really working with color quite yet. And then you have your eyedropper tool, which is similar to all Adobe products. It will either pick up the color or the effect that you have on something and apply it to something else. You have your width tool, which is going to be very useful when you're working with lines. So let's say I have this line here. I'm going to make the stroke a bit heavier so you can see it. If I have this line and I want it to come to a point here, I can use the width adjustment tool and I can go into the end of that point and I can click it and drag it inwards. And then if I want this part to be thicker, but I still want this part to come to a point, I can click it in the middle and pull it out. So that will be very useful down the line. Lastly, you have your blend tool, which is going to take two shapes and merge them together. The effects of this are really depending on whether or not they're filled or they're strokes, whether they have gradients. You will get a lot of different results. It's very fun to play around with. So if I select these two and I use this blend tool, there we go. You have to click the tools themselves and avoid the anchor points. It will then blend the two colors together. And from there, I have two shapes in a line right now. If you expand that, then it is a singular piece. So we'll play around with that a lot more down the line. Lastly is your artboard. So your artboard is kind of like your canvas or the piece of paper that you're working on. Illustrator is particularly nice in the fact that it is a vector-based program. You can change the size and orientation of what you're working on at any point and it won't affect your subject. So if you're working in Illustrator or if you're working in Photoshop and you're doing a painting and you suddenly change it to be twice as big, everything is going to be either blurrier or smaller and not fill up the whole page. But with Illustrator, at any point, you can change the artboard to any size. You can add new artboards anywhere. It is a fully customizable workspace. So that is a brief overview of all the tools. You will learn them more as you practice them. And that's it.